Thank you very much, Matt. Good afternoon, and a very warm welcome from my side to today's event on investing in the Italian climate agenda. My name is Roland Plan. I'm in charge of the corporate business at NatWest Markets in Europe. That's including the debt and financing business as well as the corporate relationships. Italy, as you know, is a co-partner of this year's 26th United Nations Climate Change Conference, which actually will take place in Glasgow in 6 weeks' time. We thought hence that it would be appropriate to have a session on the Italian climate agenda in the run-up to COP26. As you may know, NatWest Group is the sole financial sponsor to the COP26 in Glasgow. And climate change is an absolute central piece of our purpose-led strategy. Now, when discussing a client in our capital, in our credit committees, there's always a reference to that client's own climate agenda, its own climate ambitions, and such agenda plays an increasingly significant role in our decision-making process. Hence, this conference is very important to us. NatWest Group has been active in Italy for many, many years, previously under the brand names which you will also know of RBS and formerly ABN AMRO. And our business activity in Italy play a very central part of our overall European strategy. As ESG is so central to our hearts, it is natural that such an ESG-focused country such as Italy also is very significant for our overall business activities in Western Europe. We've been very active in Italy in the ESG space, across corporates, across financial institutions, SSAs, with the most notable transaction being the debut green 8.5 billion bond for the Republic of Italy in March this year. And I'm sure you'll hear a little bit more about this bond in the upcoming session. And today's purpose is really to have a multi-stakeholder debate on the financial and investment implications of the Italian decarbonization agenda. So I'd like to now hand over to our moderator, James Close. James joined the bank earlier this year, and he's the head of climate change at NatWest Group. He was previously director for climate change at the World Bank Group, where he was heavily involved in the Paris Agreement and the doubling of the World Bank's climate finance between 2015 and 2019. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to James and wish you all a very inspiring session today. And thank you very, very much for joining. James, over to you, please.
Thank you, Roland, and buongiorno, everybody. It's just a delight to be with you today. I just wish we could be together in person. Nothing quite lifts the soul like a trip to Italy, and hopefully we'll be able to be together fairly shortly. So I just wanted to give you a brief introduction to the event and a warm welcome to all our speakers who are going to cover the climate and ESG agenda in, I think, a really engaging way. And we'll start off with Arthur Krebers asking some questions that will get us warmed up, and then we'll hand over to our speakers who will give us a really good perspective on what's going on in Italy and what the consequences of that might be. And I thought I'd just say for a couple of moments about how exciting it is for the UK COP presidency to be in partnership with Italy. Both are countries that have got a really excellent multilateral agenda for 2021 through the G7, G20, and now the COP26 presidencies. And both countries really put climate change and the reversal of biodiversity loss at the heart of the work that we're doing in the countries and with our partners throughout the world. And I think the theme of COP26, of course, is to increase ambition, which was set out through the Paris Agreement and the submission of nationally determined contributions by all of the parties. And we look to that greater ambition coming forward in Glasgow. And no more is the time relevant and urgent for that in what many people have described as the decisive month, in the decisive year, in the decisive decade for climate action, as we get ourselves on a trajectory towards net zero by 2050 and halving our emissions by 2030. And it's probably just worth highlighting the 4 goals that the UK and Italy have set for the COP. The first is a step change in commitments to emissions reduction, which I think will come through NDCs and show the possibility that comes from investment in new technologies that can be rolled out much more cost effectively than anybody really imagined at the time that the Paris Agreement was settled upon. We're also, I think, very mindful of what's been happening across Europe and the world over the course of the last year in terms of rapidly shifting weather patterns, whether it's the 49-degree heat that has arisen in Sicily or the extraordinary floods that have happened in Germany and in London. We are going to have to strengthen our response to adapting to climate change. And again, that is going to require significant amounts of capital to build sustainable infrastructure to support that, sustainable and resilient infrastructure. I think yesterday and the day before at the UN General Assembly were really significant days, particularly to hear the US increase its climate pledge. And I think Italy, too, is also putting more money towards the 100 billion a year that was committed originally in Copenhagen and was codified into the Paris Agreement and is still short of where it needs to be. So hopefully by the time we get to COP, we can be demonstrating that 100 billion will flow as a floor for money going from developed countries to developing countries. And of course, post-COVID, we do need to see a step change in international collaboration, whether it's on the energy transition or clean road transport or nature. And all of those things are at the heart of the UK and Italian ambitions. And of course, the wonderful COP, pre-COP will take place in Milan together as well with the Youth COP, which COP will be in conjunction with the really fantastic organisation, Youth for Climate, which the Italian government has done so much to support. So I'd really like the opportunity to open this discussion through the British Consul General here in Milan, Catriona Graham, who also is the head of green recovery, the green industries across Europe. And she will give a few remarks around the role of the consulate and the climate agenda. So over to you, Catriona.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Roland. And thank you, NatWest, as well, for your leadership on climate and your sponsorship of COP26. It really is fantastic. Thank you for having me here today. I'm very delighted to be speaking on my favourite topic, which is the fight against climate change. This is actually the reason why I joined government in the first place. And my first job in government was with the Department of Energy and Climate Change, the year that we became the first country as the UK to set in law the commitments to decarbonisation by 2050, which are, of course, now happily widespread across developed economies. So as James said, now I'm responsible for the clean growth work on trade across Europe. And as Consul General also in Milan, I'm delighted that climate is such a central part of our relationship with Italy and our activities here in the city of Milan this year in particular. The partnership that we have on COP26 has meant that climate's been a thread that's run through both of our G7 and our G20 presidencies, bringing this leadership to the global stage. And next week, Milan has got a particular role in hosting both the events we've just heard about in the centre of the city. The strategy that the UK and Italy, that we both have together as we run up to this important conference, is that this is not a challenge solely for the politicians, although of course they must play their part, as the Prime Minister has been saying in New York this week. But it's a challenge that we need the entire of civil society to be involved in, to be committed to be talking about. And so that's why we are organising, alongside the pre-COP and the youth COP next week in Milan, extremely ambitious programme of activities involving non-state actors, young people, business, and cities, in order to give that part of society a voice and to showcase the ambition on climate that in turn we hope will raise the bar for ambition at Glasgow. So as part of that, we are encouraging all of civil society to sign up to the Race to Zero campaign under the United Nations. There is a particular campaign underneath that umbrella for the financial industry, which is the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, chaired by Mark Carney, and I'm proud to say NatWest is a founding member of that. So I would encourage you to look at that in the run-up to COP, see if your organisation too can make the science-based commitment to net zero by or before the year 2050 that we need to see from as many businesses as possible around the world to show the way, to show that this is possible. And do as well check out our series of events we've got. My team is busy with 12 different events that we're running alongside the political conference next week in Milan, but all the participation is also open to virtual participants. So I will share the information on that later so that you can see how to sign up if you're interested on those discussions with other businesses on how to get to net zero. In general, the work we're doing with Italy on climate, although it's really been a particular focus this year, is not going to stop when we get to Glasgow. It's an area of cooperation we hope to see continue to grow afterwards, and particularly in green finance, it's striking the breadth and depth of expertise that we have both in Milan and in the UK that we're hearing more and more about in the run-up to this conference. So we're keen to set up an expert group to feed advice on how we get government policy on things like standards, enforcement of standards on ESG, etc., right in the future. So do look out for that. It will be really interesting for me to hear what expertise comes out of the discussions today on that topic. Do feed back to government what the conclusions are, because we really are very keen to hear from you as the experts in this industry. So thank you again for what I know will be fruitful discussions later on, and you'll all be welcome to join us next week on the screen, but also to join us in person in beautiful Italy and Milan when the situation allows. Thank you for having me again. Grazie.
Thank you, Katrina. Really so disappointed that I can't be with you next week. It will be a wonderful set of events, I'm sure. And Arthur, over to you. I think you're going to give us some questions to warm us up and get us ready for the conversation ahead.
Right. Thank you, James. I've been asked to do a quick barometer on audience views around the Italian decarbonisation and financing agenda. So Matt, if we can load up the first question, please. Great. So the first question is around decarbonisation investments that you feel need to be prioritised in the context of the Italian market. Hopefully people who are looking at this through Zoom are able to see that, are able to select an answer and click submit. And I wonder, Matt, what the initial results are.
We still only have about 20 people answering at the moment. We're just waiting for all the answers to come through. About 30% of people have now answered. I'll give it a little bit longer to allow people to give their responses, and then I'll show the results on screen. 45% of people have now answered.
Perfect. Yes. Why don't we have a look to see where we are?
No problem at all. So we're at 55% now and just sharing the results.
Excellent, very interesting. So amidst the participants today, clearly a focus on the clean energy agenda. I think that tallies quite well with what we're seeing in the wider market, where about half of all sustainable finance frameworks have a clean or renewable energy agenda. I'm also quite heartened to see that the second place is public transportation. I think speaking to clients within the Italian and indeed wider European market, that's an area of growing focus, and clearly not just for environmental reasons, but also for the social co-benefits that exist from that. Building retrofits is also one that actually we're incredibly focused on. That's about 35% of the sustainable finance market, and one where we're seeing a lot of new product innovation as well in the securitization and mortgage space in particular. And research and development, I would agree, is important given the degree of innovation that's needed to meet the climate emergency. But with that, let me go to the second question, please, Matt. And so this talks more about then the liability structure that is needed. We've just spoken about the assets, investment that are needed. How are we going to finance that? And so what type of instrument, what type of asset class do you think needs to play a leading role here in meeting that decarbonisation challenge?
Lots of results coming in.
Perfect. Why don't we load them up, please, Matt?
No problem at all. And here are your results.
Excellent. So half of you are voting for the bond market. I think that's understandable. I mean, that remains the deepest source of liquidity, and indeed one where I think sustainable debt technology and climate technology has been most widely applied and probably most effectively structured. And thinking about the ICMA principles in particular. And as Roland mentioned, of course, in the Italian context, you've got a strong leadership also from a government point of view with the Green BTP that has been set out. Equity-like instruments, 14%. We are seeing more interest there, given again the degree of innovation and degree of risk capital that is needed to support new green technologies and new green ideas. And lending, I think, is also good to see that 21% of respondents. The beauty, we think, of the lending market is you can really tailor the investment that you're making to a particular project, to particular outcomes that you're trying to achieve. And hence, both within the Italian context and more wider in Europe, we're seeing more investors set up illiquid loan portfolios to have a clear climate agenda. But with that, let me hand it back to you, James.
Thank you, Arthur. And I think that's really interesting, actually, and a very, very efficient way of doing it as well. But it gives a sense, I think, of where the priorities lie. And I do have a little bit of a feeling that as we sit at this point in time, the urgency of climate action, the real response to those questions should be all of the above, because we are going to need all of the instruments that are available to us, and we're going to have to really accelerate all the decarbonisation opportunities through serious investments. And I think that's why this is such an extraordinary opportunity, not just for the UK and the world, but also especially for Italy, as you sit on the threshold of this wonderful Opportunità Verdi. And I'd like to, with that, hand over, please, to Rebecca Smith, who's the Sustainable Finance Analyst at VE, which is part of the Moody's ESG Solutions. And she can give us an overview of the Italian climate plans. So over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be on this panel. Thank you, Arthur, for the great warm-up questions. And I'm going to speak about several of the elements that you brought up in the questions. So indeed, I'm Rebecca Smith. I'm a sustainable finance analyst at VE, part of Moody's ESG Solutions. And I was the project manager on the second party opinion for the sovereign green bond of Italy. So next slide, please. To give a bit of background, one second. To give a bit of background, our role as the second party opinion provider was to give an independent external review of the sovereign green bond framework. We wrote an opinion, which is publicly available, and you have the link right there, where we assessed if the framework aligns with the green bond principles and market practices, as well as the expected contribution to sustainability from these green bond issuances. Based on that, today I'll talk about Italy's sovereign green bond framework, so what it will finance, how it's structured, as well as how it fits with Italy's climate strategy. The way that sovereign labeled bonds usually work is that the country's government has to identify within their budget what expenditures can be considered green. Following the green bond principles, which is the internationally recognized market standard, for the bonds to be considered green, the proceeds must be used exclusively to finance or refinance environmental projects. What this means is that for each identified expenditure, there must be associated environmental objectives and benefits. This is achieved by defining eligibility criteria that determine the selection or exclusion of expenditures and that follow recognized international standards. In order to select the relevant expenditures in the country's budget and to be able to demonstrate their greenness, the issuer has to collect and organize all the information on whether these expenditures follow the defined eligibility criteria. So the challenge here is coordination, as the information and expertise are spread across different ministries, as well as across different fiscal budgets in the case of refinancing. As such, robust interministerial governance and organizational structures are key. In the case of Italy, which is what we usually see, there's an interministerial Green Bond Committee, which is led by the Ministry of Economy and Finance. The Ministry of Finance has the overview of all of the expenditures and budgets, while all the relevant ministries, for example, environment, agriculture, or transport, have the technical knowledge on whether the expenditures of projects are aligned with the eligibility criteria set in the framework. So next slide, please. So what is inside Italy's Green Bond Framework? So they've grouped all of the eligible expenditures following the process I was just describing into 6 categories, and this indeed aligns quite well with the questions that were asked before. These categories are quite standard: renewable electricity and heat, energy efficiency, transport, pollution prevention and control and circular economy, protection of the environment's biological diversity, and research. There's one difference here in comparison with some other green bond frameworks that we see. So usually there's a sustainable, or in many other cases, there's a sustainable water management category. In this case, Italy divided water projects and put them in the protection of the environment category, and wastewater projects put them in pollution prevention and control. Next slide, please. One interesting element in the process for selecting the expenditures is that Italy takes a similar approach to the EU Green Bond Standard. So for context, the European Green Bond Standard is still at the proposal stage. So in addition to following the definitions in the 6 categories that were presented in the previous slide, when assessing eligibility for the Italian green bonds, the expenditures are also assessed against 3 criteria. The first one is significance of the contribution of the expense towards achieving one or more of the 6 environmental objectives set in the framework. And these are exactly the same as the EU's environmental objectives set out in the EU's taxonomy regulation. The second is insignificance of the contribution of the same expense towards hindering any of the 6 environmental objectives. And finally, conformity with the minimal social protection criteria of the legal framework within which the expense is made. So last slide, please. So how does this connect with Italy's climate priorities? This is something that we look at the beginning of our SPO in the part that we call coherence. This is to ensure that the green bond is not isolated from the issuer's general strategy and sustainability commitments. So here we've highlighted Italy's main commitments and targets in relation to climate change. So these are the ones that were in our SPO, which was published in February. So there have been some updates since, but so these are the ones from February. As an EU member state, Italy has endorsed the European Commission strategy to achieve climate neutrality by 2050 and is committed to achieving the goals set in the European Green Deal. In order to achieve these goals, Italy has published the Integrated National Plan for Energy and Climate, which includes targets for 2030 on energy efficiency, renewable energy, and CO2 emissions reduction. Italy has ratified the Paris Climate Agreement in 2016 and contributes to its goals via the EU's intended nationally determined contributions. And finally, Italy had a binding target of 40% domestic reduction, but I believe it's now been raised to 60%. And so as you can see from the previous categories in this, we consider that these green bonds coherently align with Italy's climate strategy and priorities, and they contribute to the realization of its environmental commitments and goals. So a few simple examples is that the expenditures that fall within the categories renewable electricity and heat and energy efficiency will contribute to Italy's goals in CO2 emissions reduction. So thank you for your attention. You're welcome to read the second party opinion, which is published on the Italian Ministry of Finance's website.
Thank you, Rebecca. Yes, some really great work coming out of your organisation. I read a really excellent report yesterday that just teed this up in a very nice way, and I think shows the importance of getting the rigour around bond issuance and ensuring that that they can be viable to meet the demand that's out there for ESG and green money. So the next intervention that we're going to have is to sort of pick up on the whole issue of growth and balance of payments and the implications of the energy transition for Italy. And I think this will be particularly interesting as we look at the opportunities that face Italy in terms of the transition from hydrocarbons and how to use the extraordinary renewable assets that sit at their disposal. And I'm delighted to introduce Frank Gill, who is the sector lead for sovereign ratings for EMEA at S&P Global Ratings. So over to you, Frank.
Good afternoon, and thanks so much for hosting this exciting event. So, as mentioned, I'm going to try to focus on the potential implications for GDP performance, as well as for Italy's balance of payments of its efforts to move towards net carbon emissions of zero by 2050. But I'm also going to discuss Italy's energy mix. And obviously, I would be remiss if I didn't flag a lot of the volatility taking place right now in the natural gas market. If we could move to the first slide. So I'm sure nearly all of you well understand Italy's pretty notable dependency on imports to essentially supply most of its domestic energy requirements. On the left is a chart which shows the percentage of gross available energy covered by imports. Those imports are largely a combination of hydrocarbons and natural gas, and you can see that even compared to Spain or to Germany, Italy's import dependency is very elevated. Though it has been slightly declining since the global financial crisis. It also it's very sensitive both to price and also to other factors like technological innovation. On that left side, you can see France is relatively less dependent on imports, given primarily a large nuclear generation capacity. And the UK, which was historically not a net importer until the early noughts, is now almost similar at the level to France. On the right-hand side, you can actually see the overall picture for total energy demand, energy supply in Italy on the right-hand side. And coal still plays a pretty big role. A notable role of about 4% in total energy generation in Italy. And one of the key priorities for authorities between now and 2030 is essentially to shut down coal generation capacity. This is going to have to take place at the same time that the economy tries to electrify and move away from hydrocarbons. And even though we expect renewables output to nearly double, mostly through solar and wind in Italy between now and 2030, we don't think that's going to be enough to really reduce Italy's historical reliance on natural gas, given we're expecting demand of energy from electrification will continue to increase as Italy decarbonizes. If we can move to the next slide. Now, this shows domestic generation. On the left-hand side is the current mix. As you saw from the previous slide, very high reliance on gas. Italy has pretty considerable hydro generation power, though we don't really expect that. If you look on the right-hand side, we don't really expect hydro to increase very importantly over the next 6 years in terms of its overall share of the mix. Remember, the size of the pie is probably going to have to get better because demand for electrification is expected to increase. We expect coal to be cut back to only 1% of the generation. I think a couple generating plants in Sardinia are probably all that will be left by 2030. Again, wind and solar increasing very much in importance. Hydro perhaps not declining as much as Italy would ideally like. So maybe the next slide, just to sum things up and to try to capture what this may mean for Italian potential growth is pretty tricky. The bottom line is that gas today remains the backbone of Italy's electricity supply. And it does leave Italy very, very much exposed to price movements. If you look at the chart on the lower right-hand side, that's S&P's official projections for wholesale average cost of gas, where obviously the spot price has been moving up very, very rapidly, but generally the utility sector in Italy is pretty well hedged against short-term price movements. So we're still arguing or still projecting that the absolute level of natural gas prices even in 2023 remains below 2018 levels. But clearly households are far less shielded from volatility of the spot price. But if we go to the next slide, I think another point to make is that there's probably higher energy prices do serve a purpose. And that is essentially to increase the cost benefits of further energy efficiency, also of further investment in alternative energy technology. And you can see that particularly between 2010 and 2014, there's been a very large drop off in overall energy consumption in Italy, despite, it is the second largest manufacturing economy in Europe. Now that has stepped up again since 2014, and partly that reflects lower prices since then. But the overall level of energy consumption, this is pre-pandemic 2019, was still compared to 2010 about 12 percentage points lower, which is pretty substantial. And I think that is evidence that the energy intensity of Italian GDP has declined. If we move to the last slide, I'll finish here. What does this all mean for long-term potential growth for Italy? Well, there's a real problem with modeling GDP for any economy, especially advanced economies, and that is because traditionally national accounts data, GDP data, it does not reflect the negative externalities, in other words, the cost of emissions. And so under our projections, we're saying if Italy halves its import dependency over between now and 2050, that the level of GDP in Italy should be, according to our modeling, roughly 4.2 percentage points higher than it would be if Italy does not reduce its energy intensity. But that does not capture, obviously, the improvement in the environment and the urgency of getting a grip on hydrocarbon consumption and the positive externalities from that. So I think GDP, I would argue, probably is failing us as a metric for the economic benefits of the transition to Italy. And I'm going to end it there and hand things back. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. I mean, that was really, really interesting, and I think a very thought-provoking final statement, and some really alarming statistics there, I think, in terms of the pace and scale of change, and particularly when you think of it in the context of the energy crisis that's gripping Europe, and particularly Italy, and the exposure that Italy has to increasing gas prices. All of which I think can be a major driver towards mobilizing finance for the transition. I want to take the conversation now into that area where we're going to talk about CDP's role in promoting environmental and sustainable impact in Italy. And CDP is the Carbon Disclosure Project is a fantastic organization that has done a huge amount of work to promote businesses declaring their emissions and so much more. And also to look at the top priorities required to meet the Italian climate objectives. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Ilario Bertizzolo, who's head of coverage of large corporates at CDP. Ilario.
Thank you, James, and thank you, Roland, for inviting me back somehow home to NatWest. Great pleasure to be here with you again. So I'm conscious of time, so if we could quickly jump into slide 3, just to make sure that we have the opportunity to briefly introduce what is the mission of Cassa Depositi e Prestiti for the sustainable development, taking into consideration that we play a very peculiar role because we are the national development institution. So by mission, actually, we do foster the development of the country using the country's savings to promote growth and to boost employment. So we do support innovation and business growth, both in terms of letting the local corporates achieving the critical mass to stay as international champion, as well as allowing them to gain geographically real global relevance outside our boundaries. And in doing so, we have to leverage strongly in boosting infrastructure and local development. All of this has been captured by our bylaws that in May 2021 have been modified to introduce as a core principle sustainability, the sustainable development, by saying that we pursue the promotion of long-term economic, social, environmental sustainability for the benefit of shareholders. And also taking into consideration that our role is that of attracting private resources also from abroad in order to increase the investment towards sustainable ends, it's very much clear that we do work as a sort of general collector of energies and projects. So moving on to next slide, what is here that we intend to do? We intend to integrate sustainability in our operating activities and also in the business model, taking as a compass for our strategy the UN 2030 agenda and also the expectation of our stakeholders. So as you can see on the right-hand side of the graph, we consider a top-down approach deriving from the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as the identification of material issues that are impacting the way we operate as a firm. So taking into account procurement cycle, HR, working environment, as well as our business proposition. We have an ex-ante and ex-post impact assessment, and we do work on monitoring our actions in order to translate our transparency into our reporting criteria. Bottom up, this means that we need to reconnect what are the needs of our stakeholders with our major goal. And by doing so, we need to listen and identify the material issues, taking in particular into consideration what are the needs of the local communities. I think all of this framework has a direct impact naturally on our governance, considering that our board relies on the advice of the Risk and Sustainability Committee and cascades the activities by a group of 125 ambassadors that allow us to reach across all groups units and transfer the message in its entirety. Moving to the next slide, that I think is quite a good graphical representation of our business model. Basically, we do generate share value through this kind of circular process, taking into account the fact that 70% of the funds that we reinject into the systems are coming from the postal savings. So actually all the capitals are employed in return to the local communities and to overall stakeholders that ultimately are the same 27 million of Italian households that are part of our bulk fundraisers. And taking your attention to the right-hand part of the slide, you can gather how our investments are translated into economic, social, and environmental values. In particular, over 2020, we have mobilized shy of 40 billion funds that have been totally directed into sustainable initiatives, impacting for something that is like 2.7% of GDP, so actually has a massive impact on what we do on the Italian GDP as well as on the activity of 90,000 enterprises. This allows us to protect the social values by maintaining jobs in excess of 700,000 headcounts, working on social housing units, almost 2,000, and making sure that the ultimate beneficiaries are low-income households. When it comes to the core topic of the day, environmental value, over the last 12 months, the reduction on group emissions has been cut by almost 50%, meaning a reduction of 16% of per capita energy intensity ratio, and 3.6 billion have been invested in energy transition and climate change. Can we please move to slide 6? Because I think this is an important consideration. So how does GDP make sure that the country priorities are also our priorities? And I'm sorry, I thought we were on slide 6, maybe? Here we are. So the sense is, of course, there is a common agenda that stems from the UN 2030 goals, but we also have to focus on a specific subset of goals. That means we work on translating a subset of projects that are really tuned to impact on actual needs. So we have associated each of these 10 targets to 10 concrete projects and the corresponding SDGs. You can take as an example, for instance, what we are doing on specifically on what has to a direct impact on clean water and sanification, considering that there is an ask from the country on the adequacy of sanitary services and wastewater, but you also see that there is a strong focus on responsible consumption, good health, and clearly last but not least, number 13, climate action, where we will see more details in the following slides. So if we can move now to slide number 7, and focusing exactly on the commitments we have as a firm in the reduction of GHG. How does this correspond to and support to the ecological transition for the country? You can see these in figures here, but I think that what is the core message that we intend to pass is that the focus on natural capital is actually naturally taking us onto climate change initiatives and a general set of activities that are aimed to protect the ecosystem. Some of these are a common theme throughout our activity, being this capital raising in a ESG sustainable manner, being this actually working for the sustainability of Italian corporates, MPAs. But there are also very bespoke initiatives that are driven by our teams, our sustainability and cooperation teams. So if we move to next slide, please, we can expand a bit on this. So clearly, Cassa Depositi e Prestiti is an enabler of SDGs through our core activities. We provide financing, we provide advisory, and by nature, we are the enabler of a series of activities that we promote as an advisor. Our interlocutors are PA funding, are the PAs, and so PA funding stays as core, corporate funding, and a general job as advisor. This takes us also to very direct initiatives in the energy and digital space. So as you can see here, there are a couple of initiatives whereby we've been working with two of our main companies, or companies where we do hold a significant shareholding quota. And as you see, Greenit is the JV that we have launched with Eni for the development of plants and the production of electrical power from renewable sources. The second one highlighted here is Renovit. That is a very interesting platform that is at country level state-of-the-art in creating and promoting solutions for energy efficiency of private and public buildings. So this is aimed really to focus on anything that is energy saving and circularity in physical buildings. Something even more fascinating from my standpoint is featured in slide number 9, where you can see the activities related with Arbolia. That is an initiative run by Cassa Depositi e Prestiti Foundation together with SNAM, and basically is an initiative that allows us to work on urban center reforesting. This is thanks to the opportunity for us as an institution to have a direct access to local communities and municipalities. So identifying areas that are within the urban belt that can be dedicated to the creation of really new green area that gets adopted by Arbolia and its corporate partners, and is allowing for a set period that may range from 5 to 10 years to reforesting, grow, care for the green, and measure the impact that this has in terms of quality of air and reduction of pollution. The other initiative that is very, very close to our hearts and is run by our International Cooperation Department together with other supranational and international partners such as EIB, AFD, and KfW, is Clean Ocean. Clean Ocean is actually focusing on something that is quite away from our boundaries, because it is an ocean target pollution and cleaning initiative that really works on the long-term sustainability of the planet in its entirety. Can we please move to next slide, just to quickly wrap up what we are doing and what we can do in terms of the activity in the country? Well, we sit in a very unique position because, as mentioned, we are shareholder of several key players in the Italian corporate space. So we have the privilege of being in the core position to organize via JVs or via really bespoke agreements a wide set of energy efficient and environmental centric initiatives. As you may imagine, this has to do with our somehow related and large group of corporates, as well as market players and local municipalities. So just to quote a couple of these, we work on Mare Energy with Eni, Terna, and Fincantieri. Mare Energy for the Italians online is clearly indicating that is the energy deriving from the wave movement. And this is something that has been part of an agreement that was actually finalized end of 2019. One other very interesting one is related with the activities on an island, in the sense that we've been working together with Terna and Regione Sicilia to work on the safety, renewable efficiency and sustainability of the electricity network in Sicily. And more of these are coming, in particular all the activities that are related with the smart city and public and private sustainable mobility do involve also market players that are somehow working at market standards. Just to clarify that everything that Cassa Depositi is doing in this space is not just that of being an enabler of sustainable initiatives from an environmental perspective, but also to guarantee that the financial sustainability is checked by a sort of a rational investor test standpoint. Now, I'm conscious of time, so I would be delighted to maybe leave at the end in the Q&A some space to a survey that we have run throughout the corporate space in Italy, trying to analyze which is the state of the art of the perception of the initiatives and also the SWOT analysis. So I really stay open for this in case there is more interested in going deeper into these activities, as well as our role as a bond issuer in the ESG space.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Ilaria. And it's just wonderful to hear what Cassa Depositi e Prestiti is doing in terms of mobilizing development finance for the benefits of Italy. And I really like the idea of focusing on country well-being and using that as a screen to use your money alongside private capital in a way that accelerates the transition and particularly aspects around natural capital, which is quite often very difficult to price, but is something that's so important for us to fund as we deal with the biodiversity emergency, which sits alongside the climate emergency. So our last intervention here will be from Luca Soria, who's the Credit and ESG Portfolio Manager at Intensa San Paolo. And he's going to talk to us about investor strategies and best practices amongst Italian ESG investors to support the climate change agenda. So over to you, Luca.
Good afternoon to everybody. And first of all, thank you very much for this invitation to this webinar and for giving me the opportunity to express the investor point of view, the Italian point of view regarding climate change risk and opportunities. In general, I think that Italian investors have started to understand that ESG risk in general need to be included in their investment process in order to improve the risk-return profile of their portfolio. Among ESG risk, climate change, which is the topic of the moment, is becoming the most pressing and urgent issue that could significantly impact both macro and micro contexts if strong mitigating efforts are not undertaken. So this, I think, may also lead to a possible reprise of financial assets, driven also from a reallocation of capital to sustainable solution over the coming years. There are too many strategies that Italian investors are considering when implementing ESG and climate into their portfolio. The first one is the negative screening, that consists of avoiding investments in sector not compliant with a social responsible approach or companies misaligned with sustainability practices. Remaining in the environmental space, the thermal coal business and other activities linked to fossil fuel exposure, it's a typical exclusion policy. The other strategy is impact investing. As you know, this is a positive and direct approach consisting of investing in assets that have direct influence on specific project green, sustainable in general. As you know, as everybody know, the GSS debt market is continuing to grow and gaining market share in the fixed income asset class. At Intesa, indeed, we strongly believe that other two strategies are more effective in mitigating the climate risk and at the same time improving the risk return of investments in the long term. And they are the best-in-class approach and engagement. The first one, so the best-in-class approach, allows to identify in each sector the issuer leader in sustainable practices, which are able to transform ESG risk in big opportunities. On the other side, engagement refers to the active dialogue and constant dialogue with issuer, more brown, in order to influence ESG practice and help them in the transition phase to a low carbon economy. So I think that a critical part of our sustainable investment strategy is the decarbonization plan of our banking book. So it's not an easy road. It's a long road that started months ago with the objective of improving the sustainable metrics of our investment in line with the commitment of the bank, and at the same time to increase again the risk return of our portfolio. So we are continuing to adapt our process in order to be aligned with the evolution of ESG dynamics. So the importance of climate topic is growing, and so internally we are dedicated a lot of time on how to improve the decarbonization of our portfolio. At the moment, our efforts are concentrated principally on the corporate bond assets, where we have defined a framework and some KPIs to integrate ESG factor, including the climate change mitigation strategy. Basically, our framework is based mainly on a positive screening through a rigorous process of selection of issuer, finalized to identify the best-in-class companies which have a proactive approach on environmental topics, and in particular regarding the reduction on greenhouse gas emission. So based on this approach, we don't want to exclude companies just because they have high carbon intensity, but we want to allocate more capital to companies that have a strong commitment and credible plan to reduce their emissions. Another pillar, very important, is the impact investing as well. So our intention is to gradually increase investments in bonds that finance green projects or sustainable business. We prefer a highly selective approach also to this big asset class, try to limiting as much as possible the greenwash practices. So this means that we include in our universe green asset of companies that have a clear and measurable sustainable policy. So as I said, decarbonization is a long-term journey, and we need to adapt to the best practice going forward. So for that reason, we are studying, first of all, how to align our portfolio to the larger extent to the Paris Agreement and to the net zero target without limiting at the same time the investable universe. And another critical point is data quality and the type of emissions that we have to consider in the definition of a carbon footprint for the whole portfolio. So we started reporting just scope 1 and scope 2 emission, which everybody know refer to the direct and indirect production of goods. But this is represent just a partial of the total carbon emission of a company. So for that reason, we are studying how to consider also scope 3 emission, which refer to the value chain, to the entire value chain of a production, and account for the majority of the carbon footprint of a company.
I think we've lost it, Luca. If I can hand it back to yourself, please, James.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry about that. And Luca in full flow, but those are the challenges that we face these days. Hopefully we'll get Luca back again, and he'll be able to join us for Q&A. And I think it'd be great if you could start thinking about the questions that you'd like to ask to our wonderful panelists and to the in the context of the presentations that we've heard, which I think really neatly give us a sort of macro view of what's going on in Italy, but also the actions that can be taken in order to address some of the opportunities and challenges that we've heard about. So it's a really good combination of colleagues who've given us some of these views, and great to see how wonderfully this is building towards the pre-COP event in Milan and also the COP when it takes place in Glasgow. So as we wait for questions to come in, and please do put them on the chat, or you can raise your hand and our Storm colleagues will put you through so that you can ask the question directly. But I thought, Ilaria, I was really interested to hear about your survey that you put together in order to consult with Italian corporations and get their views. Could you say a little bit more about what it covers and how people can get involved, please?
Let me unmute first.
Yeah,
sure, absolutely. Well, actually, what we have done, we have created a sort of virtual space for Italian corporates to meet that we named Officina Italia, whereby we regularly try and share views on things that are relevant at country level. So last July, we organized a virtual meeting involving some 20 C-level representatives of Italian corporates, let's say in the mid and large corporate space. And we were focusing on which is really, in terms of ESG, which are the part of the pillars that are felt more relevant and possibly more, I would say, more in need of support. And I think that we had a quite homogeneous indication of needs and gap, in the sense that, first of all, Italian corporates still feel that there is a widespread need to homogenize the evaluation criteria and create some sort of common vocabulary and a single measurement model. And this is something that is perceived as extremely burdensome for small companies that still do represent the bulk of our productive system. Hence, there is somehow first of all, they ask for support in this sense, coming possibly from institutions like us, and I think from rating agencies as well, to try and help translate taxonomy into models. And also, and I think this is quite a regular sort of leitmotif for Italian companies, there is a widespread hope that there will be a system of incentives that create a reward to virtuous business in this, in engaging and developing their sustainable path. The other thing that came out quite directly is that at this moment, when we talk sustainability, the first association really comes with environmental issues, but secondly, there is a strong focus on the need of focusing on the S, on the social part. So really, companies somehow need to start considering a sort of 360 kind of approach, whereby you take the social, the environmental, as well as the economic and financial approach, considering the relevance of international investors and lenders' propensity to include sustainability as a key trigger in making investment decisions.
Great, thank you very much, Ilaria, and I think that sounds like something that would be extremely valuable. Not just to you and the Italian government, but also to corporates, as you can see how you're all thinking about this, and also, of course, to those who are financing the transition. And Ilaria, I have another question for you, if that's okay, which is relating to the proposal by the Minister for Green Ecological Transition, Roberto Cingolani, to evaluate new technologies in the nuclear energy sector. What are your thoughts on that? And is this the sort of thing that Casa Depository Prestiti might help with the financing?
Actually, this takes us to the wider frame of PNRR, in the sense that clearly all relevant ministries are now involved in big work in progress with us on specific sectors and themes. So my sense is that on this specific topic, as well as on several initiatives that are involving Cassa Depositi as part of the contributors to defining the pattern, we will really need to see how the PNRR is taking the country onto the next step, and clearly anything that is related with sustainable energy production is in scope and is part of the current work in progress, I would say.
Thank you, Ilaria. And Luca, I think you're back online. We lost you a little bit before the end. Do you want to just give your close to your presentation so that we can feel as though we've got to the punchline?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Luca. Thank you.
So I don't know which at what point I no you missed my speech. Probably I was just concluding that the decarbonization it's a long term. That now we need to adapt to the best practice, and so we are studying how to align the portfolio to the Paris Agreement to net zero target without limiting the investable universe. And another point was the data quality of the emissions. So we just reporting scope 1 and scope 2 emission, which is just the direct and indirect production of goods, but we want also to include the scope 3 emission of the company, which here refers to the whole value chain and account for the majority of our footprint, so the company. So measuring scope 3 is not an easy job, and so it still relies on self-reported emission, which is not heavy job. So as soon as transparency and standardization of data improve, we will be able to obtain more progress also in this direction.
Great, thank you, Luca. And I think one of the sort of questions all of that raises in my mind is the role of financial regulation in stimulating green finance. I mean, what do you think that is, and how do you think that can have an impact?
Well, good question. I think that if I think at the last 6 years from 2015, a lot of initiatives have been taken in terms of regulation, definition of target, also in terms of awareness among social and financial community. But I think now it's in general time to act, and everybody has the responsibility to do the best to fight against the global warming. So the last report from IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, gave a red code for the planet if there isn't a swift and coordinating action to accelerate the reduction of greenhouse emissions. So first of all, to answer your question, I expect a lot of focus from political landscape, and in this sense, the COP26 that we mentioned before in November will be a great opportunity for all the countries to strengthen their commitment to net zero by 2050 and fix new rules to support the transition phase to a low carbon world. As everybody knows, also central banks are starting to play an important role in this game by introducing the climate risk in their framework or monetary policy. So in this context, we are waiting for more details on the action plan that Bank of England and ECB will provide to investors, including the corporate bond acquisition program in the next few months. It's probable, and it is my guess, that they will concentrate to the bonds of issuers that are very active in the decarbonization of their business with a forward-looking approach. So not just, I don't think that they will buy just a green bond. So I think that the eligibility criteria of the investment bank will at some point in time create some dispersion in terms of market movement between the leader and the laggard on sustainable approach in this sector. So we are waiting also from other central banks to step in, Fed in premise, to follow the Bank of England and ECB. So in conclusion, I think that the role of finance is critical to allocate capital to low carbon economy, engage with issuers about sustainability. But we need more rules in terms of regulation, transparency, standardization in order to implement new strategies. They include more and more climate consideration into the investment process.
Right, and Luca, I mean, Guido Montanino has asked a question in terms of, do you have any preferences or thoughts in relation to the use of proceeds bonds versus sustainability-linked bonds at all? And how would you sort of see those in terms of short-term versus long-term targets?
Well, I think that sustainable linked bonds, it could be a very interesting product, and probably it's a better solution respect to direct project, because it's more linked to a long-term approach. So if fixing a long-term, fixing some KPIs will help the companies now to an investor help the companies to finance this transition phase. The problem of sustainable linked bond is that probably also regarding this point we need more clarity, because for example, as a bank, we at the moment I don't know if we include in our banking book because they don't comply on SPPI tests. So also in this point, I think that it's a very good and interesting point, but I know that there is some. It's an expensive product for the issuer, because in order to implement a framework, in order to fix targets, to measuring, it's not an easy for the issuer. But also on the demand side, I think that probably on accountability or in general regulation, we need more to expand the demand for this kind of product.
Great, thank you. And Rebecca, I'm going to come to you next, if that's okay. And I think sort of to build on that point, are there opportunities to expand Italy's green bond framework and a green bond agenda, so that so this money can move to these kind of transition and green projects?
So that would be, I think, more for Italy to answer, in the sense that they're the ones who define what categories they have in their framework and what eligibility criteria they have. So they could, if they wanted, update their framework and add new categories or add additional eligibility criteria. I think one thing that's going to be very interesting to follow is the EU Green Bond Standard and the EU taxonomy. So when Italy published their framework, there were proposals out, but the EU taxonomy had not been adopted yet. And since then, in June, they adopted the EU Climate Delegated Act. So we do have now criteria for climate mitigation and adaptation. So for some of these that were already published in the proposals, were already integrated in the framework. But that could be something in the future to look at, whether to integrate these EU taxonomy criteria. And then there's always this dilemma between, do you have like a very stringent framework with a very stringent criteria and really only choose like the best in class technologies, but then have fewer projects? Or do you have something a bit wider, where you have some activities that are maybe not the greenest of the green, but are still better than what is there before, but then you're going to have an overall maybe less important impact? But that's a strategic decision for the issuer to make, and then the banks and the investors to make. And our role here is just to give the independent assessment and say, this is really like the most advanced possible impact you can have. You're following the best possible standards, or yes, or you could, an area for improvement is to set these more stringent criteria.
Great, thank you. I think that's really clear, and I think it's sort of shows the importance of getting the alignment right between objectives, regulation, frameworks, mobilization, and then of course the work that you're doing around evaluation and measurement. And I think sort of lifting this back up to the policy level. A question for you, Frank. So you talked, and I thought the graph you did that showed Italy with higher growth as a result of moving away from hydrocarbons and versus the base case of sticking with hydrocarbons, which was really demonstrating that mobilizing money for renewables is an economic growth opportunity, was very, very powerful. But What about from the point of view of your sovereign rating of Italy? I mean, how do you look at the carbon intensity and what that means for sovereign ratings, and what's the relative materiality of that compared to other aspects that you're looking at from a rating perspective? And before you answer, Frank, just to invite colleagues on the line to either raise their hands and we'll bring you in to ask the question, or to put your question in the chat. But over to you, Frank. Great to get your perspectives on the question.
Sure. So, I do think the more I have these conversations about these issues, I do think that there's a fundamental flaw with national accounting, the use of GDP as an estimate for growth potential, productivity, because what GDP does not reflect is the depreciation of and the degradation of physical, both man-made and natural assets, and therefore it completely underprices the costs, or doesn't reflect the pricing at all of global warming, of natural degradation, etc. So if you think, if you go fishing and you catch a bass and you sell it for 20 euros, your GDP is basically the 20 euros minus the cost of your labor to catch that bass. It does not reflect the potential long-term consequences for the bass population. And this is a huge mispricing. And there's something called net national product, which does essentially price the cost of depreciation into the estimate of GDP. And I think over time, there should be a shift away from GDP, which is a gross concept, to net national product. I think it's a real problem. Also, a lot of the work done by, for example, the UK Office of National Statistics shows that if you measure in gross terms, UK carbon emissions peaked in 1972. But if you take into account the emissions content of imports, especially from China and Asia, where there was a displacement of the emissions from the UK economy, mostly to China, that actually UK total emissions peaked in 2007. In terms of the sovereign rating, all these considerations, I think, are reflected in our institutional assessment of Italy and other European countries, and in the sustainability of policies. But a sovereign rating is a fairly simple concept in many respects. It just is a measurement of the ability of a government to pay its debt on time and in full. And I think a lot of the things we're talking about are bigger and beyond that. Yep. So back to you.
Great. No, thank you, Frank. We could talk all day around that, I'm sure, and some really stimulating thinking going on across the whole kind of spectrum. I think, I'm greatly encouraged by the work of people like Kate Rayworth, who talks about donut economics, and Mariana Mazzucato, the value of everything, and of course Mark Carney talking about values, not value. And I think that we're getting to the heart of the role of finance in promoting long-term well-being in national economies and collectively for the planet. So a really fascinating conversation that I'm so grateful that all of you could be a part of. And just before I close and thank our speakers, there will be a replay available, so do share it with colleagues and friends, and we'll also do a thought piece on some of the key topics that have been discussed here, which I think will be particularly rich and engaging. And so let me just thank all of our speakers. Catriona, wishing you all the best for next week, and hopefully we'll meet up in Glasgow. Frank, Ilaria, Luca, and Rebecca, really, really great insights and some fantastic challenges, I think, for all of us to think about how we take advantage of opportunity verde. And I hope that the next time we can do this, we can do it together in person And I really look forward to that day. And final thanks, of course, to Storm for hosting this, and also to my colleagues who've helped prepare it, particularly Roland Plan, and also Arthur Krebs. Thanks very much, and hope you all enjoy the rest of the day and the rest of the week, and look forward to hearing about the pre-COP in Milan next week and the COP Youth Summit. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.